September 15th, 1940. 10,000 feet above the Kent countryside, Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson's hands trembled as he reached for the canopy release of his burning Spitfire. Flames were consuming the cockpit, melting the aluminum framework around him, turning his leather gloves into charred remnants. His face was already burned, his hands blistered beyond recognition. Every instinct screamed at him to bail out, to escape the inferno that had been his aircraft just seconds before. Then he saw it through the smoke and flames. A Messerschmitt 110, 500 yards ahead, completely unaware of the burning British fighter behind it. The German crew thought they were safe, having just shot Nicholson to pieces with their cannon fire. They were already turning for home, confident in their victory. Nicholson made a decision that would define not just his life, but the entire spirit of the Royal Air Force during Britain's darkest hour. He pushed the stick forward, ignored the flames eating through his uniform, and pressed the firing button. His 8 Browning machine guns roared to life. The Messerschmitt's port engine exploded in a shower of burning oil and metal fragments. Only then, with his enemy destroyed and his own aircraft disintegrating around him, did Flight Lieutenant Nicholson finally abandon his Spitfire. He tumbled through the air, his parachute deploying just in time to save him from certain death. He would spend months in hospital recovering from his burns, but he had sent a message that echoed through the Luftwaffe's ranks. British pilots would rather burn than let a German bomber through. This was the Battle of Britain, and James Nicholson would become the only fighter command pilot to receive the Victoria Cross during the entire Second World War. His story was just one of thousands that summer, when a few hundred young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes stood between Nazi Germany and the invasion of Britain. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. Germany had assembled the most powerful air force ever created. Over 2,500 combat aircraft were poised across the Channel in occupied France, Belgium, and Norway. The Luftwaffe had swept aside every air force it had faced. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, with the world's 4th largest air force, had collapsed in 6 weeks. Now Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, had promised Adolf Hitler that he would destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 days. Britain could muster barely 700 operational fighters. Many of the pilots had never fired their guns in anger. Some had less than 10 hours in their Spitfires. The aircraft factories were working round the clock, but they couldn't replace losses fast enough. The situation was so desperate that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had to plead with the cabinet to stop sending fighters to France, where they were being lost by the dozens. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that British resolve operated on different mathematics altogether. Every factory worker who stayed at their bench during air raids was multiplying British strength. Every pilot who climbed back into his cockpit after watching his squadron mates die was canceling German advantages. Every radar operator who stayed at her post as bombs fell around the station was adding hours to Britain's survival. The breaking point would come on September 15th, 1940, the day the Luftwaffe sent its largest force yet against London, the day when everything would be decided, the day that would prove whether German numbers could overwhelm British determination. May 10th, 1940. Hermann Göring stood on the cliffs of Cap Blanc-Nez, staring across the English Channel at the white cliffs of Dover, just 22 miles away. The portly Reich Marshal, resplendent in his specially tailored gray-blue uniform adorned with medals he'd awarded himself, turned to his assembled officers with absolute confidence. "Gentlemen," he announced, raising his field marshal's baton toward England, "I see no reason why we cannot destroy the Royal Air Force within 4 days of concentrated operations. Their factories are vulnerable. Their airfields are exposed. Their pilots are exhausted from the French campaign. The Luftwaffe has never failed. It will not fail now." His staff officers nodded agreement. Why wouldn't they? The German Air Force had just completed the most successful military campaign in aviation history. In Norway, Luftwaffe aircraft had supported the invasion flawlessly. In the Low Countries, German bombers had destroyed the Dutch Air Force on the ground. In France, Stuka dive bombers had shattered French armored columns and broken the Allied armies. The statistics seemed overwhelming. The Luftwaffe could field over 1,300 bombers, 700 single-engine fighters, 300 twin-engine heavy fighters. German aircraft production was running at over 900 aircraft monthly. German pilots were the most experienced in the world, veterans of Spain, Poland, and France. Against this, Britain had fighter command. 700 fighters divided among 52 squadrons, 32 squadrons flying Hurricanes, 19 flying Spitfires, 1 flying the obsolete Blenheim. Aircraft production was struggling to replace losses. Pilot training schools couldn't graduate pilots fast enough, but Goering made the same mistake that had doomed every invader who had ever looked across at England's shores. He counted numbers without understanding what those numbers represented. Each British fighter wasn't just an aircraft, it was a pilot who had volunteered to stand between his home and destruction. It was ground crew who would work 36-hour shifts to keep their kites flying. It was factory workers who would build Spitfires in factories that were themselves being bombed. Major Adolf Galland, commanding a fighter wing based near Calais, was less optimistic than his supreme commander. The young ace with 23 victories had faced British fighters over Dunkirk and the Channel. He'd learned to respect both the Hurricane's ruggedness and the Spitfire's performance. After Goering's conference, Galland wrote in his diary, "The Reich Marshal speaks of 4 days. We who have fought the British know better. Their fighters are first-rate. Their pilots are brave to the point of madness. They dive through our bomber formations without regard for their own safety. 4 days, perhaps 40, perhaps forever." Galland's caution proved more accurate than Goering's confidence. The campaign that was supposed to last 4 days would stretch into 4 months. The Luftwaffe that was supposed to sweep the skies clean would instead bleed itself white against British resistance. The German plan, codenamed Adlerangriff or Eagle Attack, was straightforward. First, destroy fighter command in the air and on the ground. Second, eliminate British aircraft production. Third, bomb Britain into submission. Simple, direct, and according to every military analyst, certain to succeed. What the Germans didn't know was that Britain had advantages that didn't show up in aircraft counts. The chain-home radar system, the world's first operational early warning network, gave fighter command precious minutes to scramble fighters. The Observer Corps, thousands of civilian volunteers watching the skies with binoculars, tracked every German aircraft crossing the coast. The operations rooms, where Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters moved markers across tables, turned raw information into tactical advantage. Most importantly, British pilots were fighting over their own territory. Every German pilot shot down was captured or killed. Every British pilot who bailed out could be back in action the next day. The Luftwaffe was fighting at the limit of their fighters' range. Messerschmitt 109s had perhaps 20 minutes over England before fuel forced them home. British fighters could land, refuel, rearm, and be back in action within minutes. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, commanding 242 Squadron at Coltishall, explained it to his new pilots with characteristic bluntness. "Jerry has better numbers. His 109s are slightly faster than our Hurricanes. His bombers carry bigger loads than anything we've got. But we have 3 advantages that trump everything else. We're fighting over home ground. We have radar telling us where they're coming from. And we're bloody British, which means we don't know when to quit." The first major attacks came on July 10th, when the Luftwaffe began targeting Channel convoys. The goal was to draw fighter command into battles of attrition. The theory was sound. If the British didn't defend the convoys, they'd lose critical supplies. If they did defend, they'd lose fighters and pilots they couldn't replace. For 7 weeks. The battle raged over the Channel. German bombers, escorted by swarms of fighters, attacked convoys and coastal targets. British fighters scrambled to intercept. The losses mounted on both sides. Between July 10th and August 10th, the RAF lost 148 fighters and pilots. The Luftwaffe lost 286 aircraft. The mathematics should have favored Germany. They had more aircraft, more pilots, more production capacity. But the numbers told a different story. For every 2 German aircraft lost, only 1 British fighter went down. The Luftwaffe couldn't sustain those exchange rates. The Reich Marshal's 4-day campaign had already lasted a month, and fighter command was still intact. On August 13th, 1940, Goering launched Adlertag, Eagle Day. The plan called for massive attacks on fighter command airfields and radar stations. 1,500 sorties were planned. The goal was to destroy British air power in a single overwhelming blow. The day was a disaster for the Luftwaffe. Poor weather disrupted coordination. British radar gave early warning of every attack. German bombers found themselves intercepted by British fighters who shouldn't have been there. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 45 aircraft. Fighter Command lost 13. Oberst Theo Osterkamp, commander of Jagdfliegerführer II, reported to Goering, "The British are not cooperating with our timetable. They appear wherever we attack. Their intelligence is uncanny. Their pilots show no sign of weakening morale. We are suffering unacceptable losses." Goering's response was to intensify the attacks. If Eagle Day had failed to break Fighter Command, then more pressure would surely succeed. Throughout late August, German bombers hit airfield after airfield: Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, North Weald, Tangmere. The fighter stations of 11 Group, defending southeastern England, took tremendous punishment. This was Fighter Command's darkest period. The airfields could be repaired, though some were hit so often that ground crew worked in bomb craters. The problem was pilot losses. Between August 24th and September 6th, Fighter Command lost 231 aircraft and 103 pilots killed or seriously wounded. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 20 hours in their fighters. Some were shot down on their first mission. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. He needed reserves. He needed rest days for his exhausted squadrons. He needed time to train replacement pilots. He was getting none of these. In the operations room at Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Dowding watched the markers on the plotting table with growing concern. His force was being bled white. Another 2 weeks of this intensity, and Fighter Command would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. Factories were building Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than ever, but they couldn't build pilots. Then on September 7th, Hermann Goering made the mistake that would save Britain. Enraged by an RAF raid on Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from Fighter Command airfields to London. The Blitz had begun. For Fighter Command, the shift was a reprieve. While London burned, the battered fighter stations could repair their facilities and rest their exhausted pilots. New pilots could be integrated into squadrons. Damaged aircraft could be repaired. The Luftwaffe had been within 2 weeks of victory. Hitler's fury had snatched defeat from the jaws of triumph. But the Luftwaffe didn't know this. They thought London attacks would force Fighter Command to commit its last reserves. They believed British fighter strength was already broken. They were convinced that one more massive blow would finish the job. They chose September 15th to deliver that blow. A Sunday morning when the weather was forecast to be perfect. A day when they could send every available bomber and fighter against London in 2 massive waves. A day that would prove, once and for all, whether German numbers could overcome British resolve. September 15th, 1940, 6 o'clock in the morning, RAF Northolt, west of London. Pilot Officer Geoffrey Wellham, 19 years old with barely 3 months of operational flying, sat in the cockpit of his Spitfire watching the sun rise over the airfield. He'd been at readiness since 5 o'clock, strapped in, oxygen connected, radio plugged in. Waiting. The telephone in the dispersal hut rang. The orderly who answered it bellowed across the airfield, "Squadron scramble! Squadron scramble!" Wellham's thumb hit the starter button. The Merlin engine coughed, caught, and roared to life. Around him, 11 other Spitfires were starting up. Blue smoke from the exhausts drifted across the airfield. The propellers became invisible blurs. The ground crew pulled away the wheel chocks and scattered toward the edge of the field. Squadron leader Michael Robinson's voice crackled in Wellham's headphones. "Blue section, close up. We're climbing to Angels 20. Big raid forming over France." Angels 20 meant 20,000 feet. Big raid meant at least 50 German aircraft, probably more. Wellham felt his stomach tighten as his Spitfire left the ground. This was his 18th combat mission. He'd been lucky so far, just 1 damaged aircraft and no injuries. But his luck couldn't hold forever. The average life expectancy for a fighter pilot that September was 4 weeks. 25 miles away, at RAF Hornchurch, squadron leader Douglas Bader was leading his 6 Hurricane pilots into the air. Bader, who had lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident, flew with artificial limbs and a determination that bordered on obsession. His squadron was already down to 6 operational aircraft. They'd lost 3 planes the previous day. 2 pilots were dead. 1 was in hospital with burns. "Listen up, chaps," Bader transmitted as his formation climbed. "Intelligence says Jerry is sending the lot today. Could be 200 plus. Our job is simple. Get to the bombers. Ignore the 109s if you can. The bombers are what matter. One bomber destroyed is worth 10 fighters shot down. At RAF Kenly, Squadron Leader Thomas Peelpicot brought his Hurricane Squadron to readiness. Kenly had been bombed 4 times in the past 2 weeks. The operations room was destroyed. The officers' mess was rubble. They were operating from tents and mobile equipment, but every Hurricane was serviceable, fueled, and armed. Across southeastern England, 41 squadrons were coming to readiness. Nearly 300 fighters would meet the German formations. It was every operational aircraft fighter command could put in the air. If they failed, if the German bombers got through to destroy the aircraft factories and docks, there would be no reserves. This was everything. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Dowding stood in the operations room watching the plotting table. The first reports were coming in from chain home radar stations along the coast. The numbers were staggering. Raid 1 X-ray, a WAF plotter announced, pushing a marker across the table. 100 plus, altitude 15,000 approaching Dover. Another plotter added more markers. Raid 2 X-ray, 80 plus, altitude 12,000, Cap Gris-Nez area. A third plotter's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. Raid 3 X-ray, 70 plus, altitude 20,000, approaching from Cherbourg. Dowding did the mathematics instantly. Over 250 German aircraft in the first wave, the largest single attack yet. Every German bomber in northern France appeared to be in the air, escorted by every available fighter. Air Vice Marshal Park, commanding 11 Group, was already scrambling squadrons. Hornchurch and North wheeled squadrons to patrol Maidstone at Angels 20, Kenly and Croydon squadrons to Canterbury at Angels 15, Biggin Hill squadrons to Ashford at Angels 25. 23 squadrons were climbing to meet the threat. Over 200 British fighters against 250 German aircraft. The odds were almost even, but the Germans were coming in 3 massive formations that could support each other. The British were divided into squadron-sized units of 12 aircraft each. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, leading 92 Squadron from Biggin Hill, spotted the first German formation at 10:30. His combat report, filed later that day, captured what every British pilot saw. Raid approaching from southeast. Bombers in 3 layers, 15 to 20,000 feet. Dornier 17s in the lead, then Heinkel 111s, then more Dorniers. At least 60 bombers in each layer. Impossible to count the fighters. Messerschmitt 109s above, ahead, and on both flanks. We're outnumbered. About 15 to 1. Tuck's voice on the radio was calmer than his written report. 92 Squadron, this is leader. We're going through the fighters to get to the bombers. Sections of 4, astern attack. Aim for the engines. Good hunting. The mathematics of the attack were brutal. 12 Spitfires diving through at least 60 Messerschmitt 109s to reach 60 bombers. Basic arithmetic said it was suicide, but Tuck knew something the Germans didn't. British pilots weren't doing arithmetic. They were doing their duty. The Spitfires dove through the escort screen at over 400 miles per hour. Tuck's 8 machine guns hammered a 2-second burst into a Messerschmitt's belly. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away trailing black smoke. Then he was through the fighter screen and facing the bombers. A Dornier 17 filled his gun sight. Tuck fired again. His bullets walked along the bomber's right wing from tip to fuselage. The wing buckled. The Dornier fell out of formation, one propeller windmilling uselessly. Tuck had perhaps 3 seconds before the Messerschmitts caught him. He used them to hammer another bomber, seeing his bullets punch through the greenhouse nose. Then the 109s were on him. Cannon shells exploded around his cockpit. His control column was hit. His windscreen cracked. Tuck rolled hard right and dove for the cloud layer at 8,000 feet. 2 German fighters followed him down. He dove through the clouds, pulled a gut-wrenching turn that grayed out his vision, and emerged heading the opposite direction. The Germans had overshot. He was alone. Tuck's experience was repeated across the sky over Kent. British fighters diving through the fighter escorts, attacking the bombers, then fighting for their lives to escape. The German formations pressed on toward London, but they were losing aircraft with every mile. Dorniers and Heinkels fell from the formations trailing smoke and fire. Others turned back with engines shot out or crew members dead. Squadron leader Dennis Gillam, leading 615 Squadron's Hurricanes, found himself directly below a formation of Heinkel 111s. His combat report was laconic. Executed climbing attack from astern and below. Fired 3-second burst into starboard bomber. Port engine caught fire. Bomber fell out of formation. Evaded 2 109s. Attacked second bomber from beam. Observed strikes on fuselage. No confirmed result. Disengaged due to ammunition exhaustion. What Gillam's report didn't mention was that he'd attacked through a crossfire from 20 bomber gunners. His Hurricane took 7 hits. His oil pressure was fluctuating. His canopy was starred from a bullet that had missed his head by inches. But he'd brought down 1 bomber confirmed and possibly damaged another. Across the battle space, this scene repeated itself dozens of times. British fighters threw themselves at German formations without regard for the odds. German bomber crews who had faced flak and fighters over Poland, France, and the Low Countries had never experienced defensive fire this determined. Unteroffizier Hans Meyer, radio operator in a Dornier 17 of Kampfgeschwader 3, kept a detailed diary that survived the war. His entry for September 15th captured the German bomber crew's perspective. Crossed English coast at 15,000 feet. Flak immediately accurate. British fighters appeared before we reached land. I counted at least 30 Spitfires and Hurricanes. They came through our fighter escort as if it wasn't there. I saw 1 Hurricane attack a Heinkel ahead of us, blow its port engine off, then pull up into a loop and attack another bomber while inverted. Madness. Courage beyond understanding. Meyer's bomber made it to London and dropped its bombs on the docks. On the return flight, with fuel running low and 2 engines damaged, they were attacked again over Tunbridge Wells. Meyer wrote, "A Spitfire attacked from below. I fired perhaps 100 rounds. Saw hits on his wing. The Spitfire kept coming. His bullets hit our port engine. Oil everywhere. Pilot ordered bailout. I was the last one out. The Spitfire circled us as we descended in our parachutes. I thought he would shoot us. Instead, he waggled his wings and flew away. British fairness, even in war." By 11 o'clock, the first German wave was in full retreat. They'd reached London. They'd dropped their bombs. But the price had been terrible. Of the 250 aircraft that had crossed the coast, at least 25 were shot down. Another 30 were so badly damaged they'd never fly again. German fighter pilots reported encounters with British fighters who seemed to be everywhere at once. Oberleutnant Franz von Vera, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot with 8 victories, was shot down over Kent and captured. During his initial interrogation, recorded in RAF intelligence files, he made a revealing statement. "You British are mad, completely mad. We outnumbered you 3 or 4 to 1, and you attacked us like we were the minority. Your pilots fly through our formations like they're alone in the sky. They should run when they see our numbers. Instead, they attack. This is not rational. How do we fight enemies who ignore mathematics?" The interrogation officer's response wasn't recorded, but he probably smiled. Von Vera had just explained exactly why Britain would win. Because British pilots weren't doing mathematics. They were protecting their homes. At Bentley Priory, the plotting table was being cleared of markers from the first raid. But Chain-Home radar was already detecting new formations building over France. The morning battle had been just the opening round. The main event was still to come. Air Vice Marshal Park looked at the squadron status boards. Many units were refueling and rearming. Some had landed with damaged aircraft that needed quick repairs. A few squadrons had suffered casualties that left them temporarily under strength. Every operational fighter would be needed for the afternoon battle. Park turned to his controller. "Inform all sector stations. Maximum effort this afternoon. Every aircraft that can fly will fly." This is going to be the big one. He was right. The afternoon battle would involve the largest aerial combat in history to that point. And in the midst of that massive, furious combat, one Spitfire pilot would demonstrate exactly what British determination meant. September 15th, 1940, 2:30 in the afternoon, RAF Hornchurch. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, but Pilot Officer Geoffrey Wellham felt cold as ice. His squadron had landed from the morning battle just 40 minutes ago. 2 aircraft were damaged. 1 pilot was dead. Flight Sergeant Thompson had gone down over Maidstone. No parachute seen. Just a Spitfire diving vertically into a field and exploding. Now they were scrambling again. Every squadron in 11 Group was being thrown at the largest German formation anyone had ever seen. The radar stations were reporting over 200 aircraft, possibly closer to 300. Every available German bomber and fighter was coming across the channel in one massive wave. Wellham's Spitfire climbed through 10,000 feet. Around him, his squadron formed up in sections of 3. Below, he could see other squadrons climbing. Hurricanes from North Weald, more Spitfires from Biggin Hill. Every fighter in southeastern England was converging on the German formations approaching over Kent. At 20,000 feet, Wellham spotted them. He'd seen large German formations before, but nothing like this. The sky ahead seemed filled with aircraft. Bombers in layer after layer stepped up from 12,000 to 20,000 feet. Messerschmitts above them, beside them, everywhere. It looked like the entire Luftwaffe had come calling. Squadron leader Robinson's voice was tense. There must be 200 of the bastards. Sections of 3, we're going for the bombers. Break left and attack when I call. But before Robinson could call the attack, 6 Messerschmitt 109s dove from above. The neat British formation disintegrated as each pilot fought for his life. Wellham saw tracer fire flash past his canopy. He pulled hard right, felt his Spitfire shudder on the edge of a stall, then dove away from his attacker. When he recovered at 15,000 feet, Wellham was alone. The neat formations had dissolved into individual dogfights spread across 50 miles of sky. Everywhere he looked, aircraft were turning, diving, climbing. Smoke trails marked aircraft going down. He couldn't tell if they were British or German. A Heinkel 111 appeared below him, separated from its formation. Wellham dove to attack, but before he could get in range, 3 Hurricanes hit the bomber from different angles. The Heinkel's engines caught fire. It fell away, trailing flame. The Hurricanes reformed and climbed back toward the bomber stream. Wellham pulled up and found himself behind a Messerschmitt 109 that hadn't seen him. He fired a 3-second burst. Pieces flew off the German fighter's tail. It rolled onto its back and dove away. Wellham didn't follow. He'd learned that chasing damaged aircraft was how young pilots got killed by their victims' friends. 20 miles away, squadron leader Peter Townsend was leading 43 Squadron's Hurricanes in a head-on attack against a formation of Dornier 17s. The tactic was terrifying for both sides. The combined closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. The time window for accurate shooting was less than 2 seconds. But head-on attacks disrupted bomber formations and often made the lead aircraft break away. Townsend's combat report stated simply, executed head-on attack against leading bomber, fired 4-second burst, observed strikes on cockpit area, bomber broke left and down, possible crew casualties, continued attack on second bomber, ammunition exhausted, disengaged, and returned to base. What the report didn't mention was that Townsend's Hurricane had been hit by return fire from at least 10 bomber gunners. His port wing had a cannon shell hole you could put your fist through. His oil cooler was leaking. His wireless was destroyed. He made it back to Northolt with his engine temperature in the red and his oil pressure at 0. The ground crew counted 37 bullet and shell hits on his aircraft. At Biggin Hill, squadron leader Michael Crossley led his squadron into a formation of Heinkel 111s that were bombing the airfield itself. His pilots could see the bombs falling, see the explosions walking across their home field, see the barracks and hangars being destroyed. The motivation didn't need explaining. Crossley's Spitfire led the attack through the bomber formation. His 8 machine guns fired steadily as he flew through the German formation, selecting targets with each burst. One Heinkel's port engine exploded. Another fell out of formation with smoke pouring from its bomb bay. A third turned away with its cockpit shattered. But the price was high. Crossley's wingman, Sergeant Davies, was hit by return fire and crashed into the woods north of the airfield. Another pilot, Flying Officer Harrison, bailed out over Sevenoaks with his aircraft on fire. The squadron shot down 4 bombers confirmed, but they'd lost 2 pilots and 3 aircraft. This was the pattern across the entire battle space. British fighters tearing into German formations regardless of the odds. German bombers pressing on despite mounting losses. The fighters from both sides locked in individual combats that spread across the entire sky over southeastern England. Unteroffizier Klaus Fischer, a gunner in a Dornier 17 of Kampfgeschwader 76, described the intensity in a letter to his family written after his capture. We were attacked continuously from the moment we crossed the English coast until we escaped back across the channel. I counted at least 15 different British fighters attacking our formation. They came from above, below, from the sides, even head-on. Every time we shot one down, another appeared. Our pilot said he'd never seen such determined opposition. 3 of our formation of 9 aircraft were shot down before we reached the target. 2 more fell on the way back. Our aircraft was so badly damaged we crashed on landing in France. I am told I am lucky to be alive. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the battle reached its peak. Over 300 aircraft were engaged in combat across a 50-mile front. The radio frequencies were jammed with calls. 109 on your tail. Bomber breaking right. I'm hit bailing out. Tally-ho, attacking now. In the midst of this chaos, Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of 249 Squadron found himself in a fight that would define British courage for generations to come. Nicholson's section of 3 Hurricanes was patrolling at 15,000 feet near Southampton when they were bounced by 4 Messerschmitt 110s. The twin-engine heavy fighters had the advantage of altitude and surprise. Cannon shells ripped into Nicholson's Hurricane before he even knew he was under attack. The first shell exploded in his engine compartment. The Hurricane's Merlin engine seized instantly, the propeller stopping dead. The second shell detonated in the cockpit, severing hydraulic lines and fuel lines. Burning aviation fuel sprayed into the cockpit. The third shell hit the instrument panel, filling the cockpit with shrapnel. Nicholson was hit in multiple places. Shell fragments tore into his face and left eye. His left hand was mangled. His right leg was injured. Burning fuel was soaking through his uniform and igniting his clothes. Every survival instinct he had screamed at him to bail out immediately. He reached for the canopy release. The canopy was jammed. He tried again. Harder, still jammed. He was trapped in a burning aircraft that was falling out of control. Then, through the smoke and flames, he saw a Messerschmitt 110 about 400 yards ahead, slightly below. The German crew thought they'd killed him. They were flying straight and level, probably congratulating themselves on another victory. Nicholson made his decision. He couldn't bail out. His canopy was jammed. He was going to die anyway, but he could take that German with him. He pushed the stick forward with his right hand. His left hand was too badly injured to be useful. The Hurricane responded despite the dead engine, trading altitude for airspeed. The flames in the cockpit intensified. The fire was consuming the leather of his flying suit, burning through to his flesh. At 300 yards, Nicholson pressed the firing button. His 8 Browning machine guns still worked. The stream of bullets walked up the Messerschmitt's fuselage. He adjusted his aim slightly. The bullets stitched across the port engine. Black smoke erupted. The Messerschmitt's wing dropped. Nicholson kept his finger on the firing button, kept the stream of bullets pouring into the stricken German aircraft. He could feel his skin blistering, could smell his own flesh burning, could see his leather gloves melting onto his hands, but he kept firing. At 200 yards, the Messerschmitt's port engine exploded. Burning oil sprayed back across the fuselage. The German aircraft rolled inverted and began its death dive toward the channel below. Only then did Nicholson try the canopy again. This time, perhaps because the metal framework had expanded from the heat, it opened. He released his straps and was blown clear of the aircraft by the slipstream. The sudden transition from burning hell to cool air was almost shocking. His parachute deployed automatically. As he drifted down through 8,000 feet, he could see the battle continuing around him. Spitfires and Hurricanes wheeling and diving, German bombers pressing on toward their targets, more aircraft falling in flames or trailing smoke. The entire sky was at war. Nicholson had burns over 40% of his body. Both hands were so badly burned that doctors initially thought they might need amputation. His face required extensive plastic surgery. He would spend 4 months in hospital undergoing multiple operations. But he had sent a message to every Luftwaffe pilot who heard the story. British pilots would rather burn alive than let a German aircraft go free. That level of determination couldn't be defeated by superior numbers or better tactics. It could only be respected and feared. The afternoon battle raged until nearly 5 o'clock. By then, almost every operational fighter in Fighter Command had been in the air. Many had flown 3 sorties. Some pilots had flown 4. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and tea, held together by nothing more than will and duty. The German formations, those that survived, limped back across the channel. They'd dropped their bombs on London and other targets, but the price had been catastrophic. Of the approximately 270 aircraft in the afternoon wave, at least 35 were shot down. Another 45 were so damaged they'd never fly combat again. The kill ratio that Göring had promised would favor Germany was running 2-to-1 in Britain's favor. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Dowding surveyed the day's results. Fighter Command had lost 26 aircraft destroyed and 13 damaged beyond immediate repair. 20 pilots were dead or missing. 7 were wounded, but the Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft confirmed destroyed, with perhaps 30 more that would never fly again. More importantly, the German formations had been disrupted at every point. Their bombing had been scattered and ineffective. No major target had been knocked out. Fighter Command's airfields were still operational. The day aircraft factories were still producing. Britain was still in the fight. Dowding turned to his senior controller. Tell Park his boys did magnificently. Tell all the groups this was Fighter Command's finest day. He was right. September 15th, 1940, would go down as the decisive day of the Battle of Britain, the day when British courage faced German numbers and won, the day when pilots like James Nicholson proved that determination could trump mathematics. September 16th, 1940, Karrenhall, Hermann Göring's country estate north of Berlin. The Reich Marshal sat behind his massive desk, reading loss reports from the previous day's operations. His face grew darker with each page. The numbers were devastating. 60 aircraft lost, 40 more damaged beyond immediate repair, 100 aircraft essentially removed from the order of battle in a single day. At this rate, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective force within a month. Oberst Josef Schmid, Chief of Intelligence for the Luftwaffe, stood before Göring's desk with more bad news. Herr Reich Marshal, our estimates of British fighter strength appear to have been optimistic. We calculated they had perhaps 200 fighters remaining. Yesterday, they put up at least 300, possibly more. They're producing aircraft faster than we can destroy them. Göring slammed his fist on the desk. Impossible. How can a nation we have bombed continuously for 3 months still be producing fighters? Where are these aircraft coming from? Schmid consulted his notes. The Supermarine factory at Southampton continues production despite 3 bombing raids. The Hawker factory at Kingston is operating at full capacity. Additionally, they have shadow factories across the Midlands that we haven't been able to locate precisely. Our intelligence suggests they're building 50 to 60 fighters per week. And our production? Göring asked, though he already knew the answer, 180 to 200 aircraft per month, across all types. But Herr Reich Marshal, production isn't our problem. Pilot losses are. We lost 38 pilots yesterday, killed or captured, including 5 experienced formation leaders. These men cannot be replaced. Göring stood and walked to the window. Outside, the September sun shone on the carefully manicured grounds. Inside, his confidence was crumbling. The Luftwaffe had never failed before. But against Britain, against those few hundred fighter pilots in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, German numbers and German experience weren't enough. Major Adolf Galland arrived for his scheduled meeting with Göring that afternoon. The young ace, now with 37 victories, had been summoned to give his assessment of the situation. Göring's question was direct. Galland, what do you need to defeat the Royal Air Force? Galland's answer would become famous. I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my group, Herr Reich Marshal. Göring's face turned purple with rage, but Galland continued, calmly explaining the reality that Göring didn't want to hear. The Messerschmitt 109 was a superb fighter, but it had critical limitations. Its range meant it could spend only 20 minutes over England before fuel forced it home. The Spitfire, fighting over its own territory, had unlimited endurance. British pilots who bailed out were back in action the next day. German pilots went to prisoner of war camps. More fundamentally, Galland explained, British pilots were simply more motivated. They were defending their homes. They didn't calculate odds or worry about tactics. They just attacked, regardless of numbers. How do you defeat an enemy who won't acknowledge when he's beaten? Across the channel, Air Chief Marshal Dowding was conducting his own assessment. Fighter Command had won September 15th, but the victory had been narrow. If the Luftwaffe had pressed home their attacks for another 2 weeks with the same intensity, Fighter Command would have collapsed. The pilot shortage was that critical, but Dowding recognized what the Germans didn't. September 15th marked the point where Luftwaffe morale began to crack. German bomber crews who had been confident in July were shaken by September. German fighter pilots who had joked about weak British opposition in August were exhausted and demoralized by September. The mathematics of attrition were working in Britain's favor, not because British production exceeded German production. It didn't. Not because British fighters were superior to German fighters. The Spitfire and Messerschmitt 109 were roughly equal. But because every day the battle continued, fighter command got stronger while the Luftwaffe got weaker. British factories were untouched by bombing. German factories were starting to feel the effects of RAF night raids. British pilots fought over friendly territory. German pilots fought at the limit of their range over hostile ground. British resolve was strengthening. German confidence was cracking. On September 17th, Adolf Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The official reason given was unsuitable weather. The real reason was that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Without control of the skies, the German Navy couldn't protect an invasion fleet. Without an invasion, the strategic purpose of the air campaign evaporated. The Battle of Britain would continue through October, with the Luftwaffe shifting to night bombing of cities. But the decisive phase was over. September 15th was the high-water mark of German aerial power. After that day, the Luftwaffe would never again be able to mount the kind of massed daylight attack that had seemed so overwhelming that September afternoon. The human cost of Britain's victory was measured in young lives. Between July 10th and October 31st, Fighter Command lost 544 pilots killed and 500 wounded. Nearly half the pilots who began the battle didn't survive it. The average age of the fallen was 23, but these young men had achieved something unprecedented in military history. A numerically inferior force had defeated a larger, more experienced enemy through nothing more than courage and determination. They'd proven that will could triumph over numbers, that fighting for your home gave advantages that couldn't be calculated on planning tables. The statistics of September 15th tell the story with brutal clarity. The Luftwaffe sent approximately 250 aircraft in the morning wave and 270 in the afternoon. A total of 520 aircraft, the largest force assembled for a single day's operations. They faced perhaps 300 British fighters across both waves, with many squadrons flying multiple sorties. The Germans lost 60 aircraft confirmed destroyed. They lost another 40 damaged beyond repair. They lost approximately 90 pilots killed or captured. Fighter Command lost 26 aircraft destroyed, 13 damaged, 20 pilots were killed, 7 were wounded. The kill ratio was over 2-to-1 in Britain's favor. More importantly, the damage ratio was nearly 4-to-1. For every British fighter taken out of service, the Germans lost 4 aircraft. They couldn't sustain those losses. Britain could. But beyond statistics, September 15th represented something more profound. It was the day when British courage faced German power and won. The day when pilots like James Nicholson proved that the human spirit couldn't be calculated like aircraft production or fuel reserves. The day when Hermann Goering's 4-day campaign died in flames over the Kent countryside. The interrogation reports from captured German airmen revealed the psychological impact. Unteroffizier Hans Meyer, the Dornier radio operator shot down over Kent, told his interrogators, "We thought we were facing a beaten force. Instead, we met pilots who fought like they had nothing to lose. Every time we pressed an attack, they came at us harder. This kind of courage cannot be defeated. It can only be respected." Oberleutnant Franz von Vera, the Messerschmitt pilot captured in the morning battle, was more direct. "You British should have lost. By every calculation, we should have destroyed you in July. But you don't calculate. You just fight. That's why you won." The phrase, "the few," came from Winston Churchill's speech to Parliament on August 20th, when he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those few were the pilots of Fighter Command. The young men who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day, knowing that each sortie might be their last. On September 15th, 1940, those few stood between Britain and invasion, between democracy and tyranny, between freedom and occupation. They faced overwhelming odds. They ignored the mathematics. They did their duty. And they won. James Nicholson recovered from his burns after 4 months in hospital. He would fly again, though never in fighters. His hands, despite multiple surgeries, never regained their full function. He served the remainder of the war as an RAF staff officer, helping train the new generation of fighter pilots who would take the war to Germany. On November 15, 1940, King George VI presented Nicholson with the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace. The citation read in part, "Flight Lieutenant Nicholson demonstrated exceptional courage and devotion to duty. Though wounded and his aircraft in flames, he continued to engage the enemy until his ammunition was exhausted. His determination to destroy enemy aircraft regardless of personal danger exemplifies the highest traditions of the Royal Air Force." Nicholson was embarrassed by the attention. He insisted he'd done nothing special. He'd simply done his job. Like every other RAF pilot that summer, he'd fought when fighting was needed. The fact that his fight involved staying in a burning aircraft for an extra minute didn't seem to him particularly remarkable. But to everyone else, Nicholson's actions on September 15th symbolized what made Fighter Command victorious, not superior aircraft, though the Spitfire and Hurricane were excellent fighters. Not better tactics, though British tactics evolved and improved throughout the battle. But simply this: British pilots wouldn't quit. They'd take any punishment, accept any odds, face any danger, rather than let German bombers through. Nicholson was killed in May 1945, just days before the war in Europe ended. He was flying as an observer in a Liberator bomber over the Bay of Bengal when the aircraft crashed into the sea. His body was never recovered. He was 48 years old. He remains the only Fighter Command pilot awarded the Victoria Cross during the Second World War. The other pilots of September 15th had varied fates. Geoffrey Wellham survived the war with 8 confirmed victories. He would write a memoir, First Light, that became one of the classic accounts of the Battle of Britain. Douglas Bader was shot down and captured in August 1941. He spent the rest of the war in German prisoner-of-war camps, from which he made multiple escape attempts despite his artificial legs. Robert Stanford Tuck shot down 29 German aircraft before being shot down himself over France in January 1942. He spent 3 years in Stalag Luft 3 before escaping during a forced march in early 1945. Adolf Golland survived the war with 104 victories. He would later write, "The British pilots of 1940 were the best I ever faced. They fought with a courage that transcended training or tactics. The aircraft themselves became legends. The Spitfire would serve throughout the war in progressively more powerful variants. The final versions, with Rolls-Royce Griffon engines producing over 2,000 horsepower, bore little resemblance to the early Spitfires that fought the Battle of Britain, but the name carried the mystique of 1940, when a few hundred Spitfires helped save civilization. The Messerschmitt 109 also evolved throughout the war. Later variants with improved engines and weapons were formidable fighters that gave Allied pilots serious trouble. But the 109 never escaped the shadow of the Battle of Britain when it failed to achieve the air superiority that German strategy required. The strategic lessons of September 15th echo through military history. Superior numbers don't guarantee victory if the numerically inferior force has stronger motivation. Technological parity means that human factors become decisive. Fighting over friendly territory provides advantages that can offset numerical inferiority. And most fundamentally, an enemy who won't quit can't be defeated simply by applying more pressure. Modern air forces study the Battle of Britain as the first and perhaps most important air campaign in history. The principles established that summer remain valid. Air superiority is essential for modern military operations. Radar and early warning systems are critical force multipliers. Pilot quality matters more than aircraft numbers. And morale, that intangible factor that can't be measured on a spreadsheet, often determines outcomes. For Britain, September 15th marked the point when survival became certain. The invasion threat didn't completely disappear until 1941, when Germany invaded Russia. The bombing continued through the Blitz and beyond. But after September 15th, informed observers knew that Britain wouldn't fall. The RAF had proven it could match and beat the Luftwaffe. That meant invasion was impossible, and that meant Hitler had lost his chance to win the war. For Germany, September 15th marked the beginning of strategic defeat. After failing to defeat Britain, Germany was committed to a two-front war. The Luftwaffe, weakened by the losses over Britain, would never recover its strength. German pilot losses in 1940 couldn't be replaced. The experienced cadre that had trained in Spain and fought in Poland and France was gone, killed over Kent and Sussex by pilots who should have been overwhelmed by German numbers. The human dimension remains the most powerful aspect of the story. On one side, young German pilots and air crews who believed they were fighting for their nation's survival. On the other, young British pilots who knew they were fighting for civilization itself. Both sides showed courage. Both sides suffered losses, but only one side was fighting for its home. That made all the difference. German pilots who were shot down over Britain went to prisoner of war camps. British pilots who were shot down over Britain bailed out, had a cup of tea, and were back in action the next day. German bomber crews who pressed through the fighter defenses faced pilots willing to ram them if necessary. British pilots who faced overwhelming odds attacked anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. September 15th, 1940. The day the Luftwaffe sent 520 aircraft against Britain in two massive waves. The day Fighter Command put up every operational fighter to meet them. The day when the mathematics said Germany should have won, but British courage wouldn't accept that outcome. The day when one pilot, his aircraft burning around him, his flesh cooking in the flames, stayed in his cockpit long enough to kill the German who had shot him down, because letting that German go free was unacceptable, because duty mattered more than survival, because being British meant never giving up, no matter the cost. James Nicholson didn't stop the entire German Air Force single-handedly. No one pilot could have done that. But his actions on that September afternoon, repeated by hundreds of his comrades in hundreds of individual combats, created a defense that German numbers couldn't overcome. Each pilot who attacked despite the odds. Each pilot who stayed in the fight despite damage to his aircraft. Each pilot who climbed back into his cockpit after watching his friends die. Collectively, they created something that the Luftwaffe couldn't defeat, not because they had better aircraft, not because they had superior tactics, but because they simply refused to quit, because being outnumbered didn't matter when you were defending your home, because mathematics and logic and rational calculation had no place in the equations that summer. The sky over Britain on September 15th belonged to men like James Nicholson, men who would rather burn than fail, men who calculated odds differently than German planners in Berlin expected, men who proved that courage, properly applied, trumps everything else. The Germans sent 250 aircraft in the morning, another 270 in the afternoon, 520 aircraft total, the largest aerial armada ever assembled to that point in history, an overwhelming force that should have crushed Fighter Command and opened the door to invasion. One Spitfire pilot burning alive in his cockpit decided that the German who shot him down wouldn't go home that day, made that decision knowing it would cost him months of agony in hospital, knowing he might lose his hands, knowing he might die, but making it anyway, because that's what British pilots did in 1940. That's why the Luftwaffe failed, not because of production figures or tactical innovations, but because they faced pilots who valued duty above survival, who fought not because they calculated they could win, but because they knew they couldn't lose, who turned 1940 into Britain's finest hour through nothing more than courage, determination, and an absolute refusal to quit. The Reich Marshal had promised 4 days. It took 4 months, and in the end, German numbers weren't enough, because numbers can't defeat the human spirit. Numbers can't overcome courage. Numbers can't win when facing men who simply will not be beaten. September 15th, 1940. The day the mathematics died over Kent. The day British courage beat German calculations. The day one burning Spitfire proved that determination trumps everything else. The day the few saved the many.